The faint hum of crickets outside the window was the only sound breaking the silence of the night. Irene sat on her bed, staring at her baby bump and uncontrollable tears streaming down her face. A cruel reminder of how much her life had changed. The world had felt so different just a few months ago. She had dreams of finishing her university education, pursuing a career in pharmacy, and making her parents proud. But now, everything was uncertain. Her hands instinctively moved to her stomach, where a tiny life was beginning to grow. It was Feemy's child, the man she had fallen so deeply in love with. He was her first love. The previous night's confrontation was still fresh in Irene's mind. She could still hear her father's voice, booming with fury, and her mother's quieter, tearful disappointment. Pregnant? At your age? How could you do this to us, Irene? Her father had roared. Her attempts to explain, to make them see her love for Feemy, had fallen on deaf ears. Instead, they had locked her in her room, seized her phone, leaving her to confront her fears alone. As the hours dragged on, Irene tried to push away the lingering shame she had brought to her family and the guilt she felt. She thought about Feemy, his smile, the way he had promised to stand by her, and how he always told her that their love could overcome anything. But could it really? Could they survive her parents' wrath and the challenges of raising a child together? It would have been better I took out this child, but Feemy refused. Now where is he? I am here all by myself facing the consequences of our actions. My dreams on hold indefinitely. Irene's tears came down more freely as she thought to herself. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Deep inside, she held on to one fragile hope, that somehow her parents would come to understand, and that she and Feemy would find a way to build a life for their unborn child. Downstairs in the spacious living room of the Bankole household, the tension was palpable. Mr. Bankole paced back and forth, his fists clenched at his sides. His wife sat on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. This boy has ruined her, Mr. Bankole growled, his voice thick with anger. What kind of man gets a girl pregnant and then fills her head with nonsense about love? He's young, Mrs. Bankole replied gently. They both are. We can't change what's happened, but we can decide how we handle it. Handle it? Mr. Bankole's voice rose. Do you think I'll sit back and let this boy destroy my daughter's future? Irene had everything, a good education, a promising career ahead of her, and now she's throwing it all away for him. Where did we go wrong in bringing Irene up? We instilled good morals in her, we didn't let her mingle with other children, we gave her everything, we did everything a parent will do to protect their child, we gave her the finest things of life, and just a little freedom. She gets into drugs and falls pregnant for one small boy? Irene should have known better, she should have done better. Mrs. Bankole sighed, her heart aching for both her daughter and her husband. She had seen the pain in Irene's eyes during the argument, and she knew that pushing too hard could drive their daughter further away. But don't you think we were too strict on her? Not allowing her to be able to trust us as her parents? Over-caging her in the disguise of protecting her? Don't you think that was too much? A part of me feels guilty. I feel we have a huge part of this blame too. My husband, we have been too hard on Irene, our expectations on her were too much, we hid her from the real world, though it was driven by love, but somehow we missed it, and that is why the moment she had a glimpse of freedom she didn't know how to act. Mrs. Bankole said, tears streaming down her face. Maybe we're not seeing the full picture, she suggested cautiously. We've never even met Feemy properly. What if we're wrong about him? What if he's trying to do the right thing? Mr. Bankole stopped pacing and turned to face his wife, his eyes narrowing. Do you really believe that? Do you think someone who introduced our daughter to drugs and reckless behavior deserves a second chance? I'm not saying I trust him, Mrs. Bankole admitted. But Irene loves him. And she's carrying his child. If we force her to choose between us and him, we might lose her entirely. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Mr. Bankole clenched his jaw, his mind racing with thoughts of disappointment, anger, and fear. Deep down, he knew his wife was right. Fine, he said finally, his tone gruff. We'll meet him. But I'll do it my way. Mrs. Bankole nodded, relieved that he was at least willing to consider it. Thank you, she said softly. But as her husband walked away, She couldn't shake the feeling that their family was standing on the edge of a precipice. Femi, on the other side, felt lost. For days he had not been able to reach Irene. He tried her number several times but it was switched off. 4 days, Femi couldn't eat or sleep. The thought of Irene and his baby overwhelmed him. He really wanted to be there for her, admitting he was the one that had put her in the situation. She was innocent when I met her, but I took all that away from her, he said, tears running down his face. I am to be blamed for all this. I have to find a way to make it right. I must right my wrongs, he resolved. The days felt longer and heavier for Irene as she sat in her room, the walls closing in around her. The only time her room door was open was when they brought her food. She knew her parents weren't just angry, there was disappointment too, and it weighed heavily on her heart. They had always been her rock, the ones who encouraged her to pursue her dreams, to aim for success although in a dictatorship manner. And now, in her darkest moment, they had turned away. Her mind drifted back to Femi. They had met 2 years ago in school during her 100-level registration and it had been instant for her. His smile, his confidence, his way of listening, she had fallen deeply in love. But in the midst of everything now, it felt like their love was slipping through her fingers like sand. She had not been able to talk to him in days because her parents had seized her phone. I'm sorry, Femi, she whispered to herself, tears flowing silently. She could still hear her father's voice, filled with disappointment. How could he introduce our daughter to such a dangerous habit? The drugs were a mistake. A moment of weakness that spiraled out of control. But she wanted to change. She had to change, for her baby. Hours later, the door to her room creaked open. Her mother stepped in, her face soft but still lined with worry. I brought you some food, Mrs. Bankole said quietly. Irene glanced up, her eyes red and swollen. Thank you, she murmured. Mrs. Bankole sat down beside her, her voice gentle. I know you're hurting, Irene. I and your father are also hurt. But pushing you away isn't going to solve anything. You're my daughter, and I want to support you, no matter what happens. A huge part of this situation is our fault. We let you down, but we did it from a place of love. I love him, Mama, Irene whispered. More than anything. I know, her mother said with a sigh. And maybe Femi loves you too. But love isn't enough. Not when there's so much at stake. I've stopped, Irene added quickly. I'm not touching it again. I'm going to be the best mother I can be. For my baby. For us. Mrs. Bankole nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edges of her wedding ring. I believe you, Irene. But love and responsibility go hand in hand. Femi needs to prove himself. I will help him, Irene said firmly. Together, we can build something. Mrs. Bankole gave her daughter a long hug, holding her tightly. I hope so, my child. I really do. The next day, Irene was shocked when her parents Mr. and Mrs. Bankole entered her room, handling her phone to her. Call that your Femi boy. Tell him I and your mother wants to see him, Mr. Bankole said with a passive voice. Are you serious? Irene asked cautiously, unsure if this was a trap. Yes, her father replied, his tone firm. We want to meet the man you claim to love and who is responsible for this situation. With trembling hands, Irene dialed Femi's number. When Femi saw the call, his heart raised with joy. For days he has been unable to reach her. Femi answered the call with so much excitement in his voice, and Irene explained the situation. My parents want to meet you, she said nervously. Really? Femi sounded surprised. Are they okay with us? I don't know, Irene admitted. But please, just come. I will send you the house address, Irene said. The following day, Femi arrived at the grand mansion of the Bankole family. Although he had always known that Irene came from a wealthy background, the sheer magnificence of the estate left him utterly speechless. The opulence surrounding him was beyond anything he had ever imagined. From the towering gates adorned with intricate designs to the sprawling gardens meticulously landscaped with exotic flowers, every detail spoke of immense wealth and taste. As he stepped through the grand entrance, the sight of the shimmering chandelier, marble floors, and lavish decor took his breath away. It was a level of luxury he had never encountered before, and he couldn't help but marvel at the splendor before him. Femi was very nervous, his palms sweaty inside his pockets. He was wearing his best shirt and trousers, but the effort seemed futile against the heavy weight of expectation. He was ready to stand tall and respectful as he faced Irene's parents. When he stepped into the house, Mr. and Mrs. Bankole were seated in the living room, their expressions unreadable. Femi bowed slightly in greeting, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Good afternoon, sir and ma," he said respectfully. Mr. Bankole's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing him with a harsh gaze. "So, you're the boy who thinks he can take care of my daughter?" Femi inhaled deeply. "Yes, sir. I know I've made mistakes, but I love Irene. And I'm willing to take responsibility for her and our child." Mrs. Bankole shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Do you have a job? What do you want to use to take care of my daughter? You are just a 300-level student," she asked bluntly. "No ma," Femi admitted. "Though I'm still a student. I've started working on a business idea, small logistics, just to support us. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Mr. Bankole scoffed. "A dream, just like the others. How are you going to provide for Irene and your child with nothing but ideas?" "I'll make it work," Femi said with confidence. "Everyone starts from somewhere, sir. You did too." The words hung in the air for a moment, shocking both Mr. and Mrs. Bankole into silence. "You have a lot of nerve," Mr. Bankole finally said, breaking the silence. "But you're right. I did start with nothing." He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "All right, tell me about this idea of yours." Femi explained his logistics business, focusing on how he planned to build it from the ground to the top. He shared his research and his determination to create something sustainable for Irene and their child. His voice was steady, and his eyes held a fire that was hard to ignore. Mrs. Bankole frowned, her mind still haunted by Femi's earlier mistakes. "What about the drugs, Femi? How do we know you're not going to bring them back into Irene's life?" Femi's face darkened slightly. "You're right. I messed up. I introduced Irene to them, and that was wrong. But I've already quit. I'll do whatever it takes to prove myself." Mr. Bankole leaned forward, studying Femi with intense scrutiny. After a moment, he let out a heavy sigh, his anger fading slightly. "You've got guts," he muttered. "I'll give you that. But proving yourself isn't just about words. It's about actions. You will finish school. You will build that business. And you will provide for my daughter and grandchild the life she is used to, because if you fail, you'll answer to me." Femi swallowed hard, nodding firmly. "I won't let you down, sir." There was a brief pause before Mr. Bankole extended his hand. Femi grasped it firmly, sealing the silent promise. Mrs. Bankole gave a small, approving smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's a start," she said softly. Days turned into weeks, and Femi remained determined to prove himself. He avoided the old temptations, stayed away from old friends, and became more focused on his studies, and spent every spare moment working on his business idea. Irene was at home but offering her unwavering support to Femi. Mr. and Mrs. Bankole watched from a distance, still skeptical but slowly warming to the changes they saw. Femi had a seriousness in him now, a maturity that had been absent during their first meeting. He was driven, constantly working toward a future that included their daughter and grandchild. Mrs. Bankole and Irene visited the hospital regularly for her antenatal appointments. Despite the whispers and rumors that spread as news of Irene's pregnancy traveled through their circles, Mrs. Bankole remained unwavering. Her priority was to restore harmony and stability to her family, paying no attention to the opinions of others. One evening, Femi arrived at the Bankole mansion with an invitation, an honest and heartfelt gesture meant to bridge the gap between them. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it was a step toward gaining their trust. The dining room was elegantly set, with soft lighting and a carefully arranged table. Mr. and Mrs. Bankole sat across from each other, their usual reserve in place. Femi, dressed in a simple but polished outfit, sat at the opposite end, his hands folded politely on his lap. Irene sat beside him, her gaze steady, her presence a silent source of comfort. The conversation began cautiously. Small talk led to deeper discussions about family, values, and the future. Femi spoke with sincerity, his words measured but meaningful. I want to make sure Irene and our child have everything they need, Femi said, his voice calm. I know I'm not perfect, but I'll work hard to make up for my past mistakes. Mrs. Bankole's eyes softened. It's not just about hard work, Femi. It's about trust. Femi nodded. I understand that. And I'm willing to earn it. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a mutual respect forming in the air. The dinner moved on, each moment a tiny step toward healing. A few weeks later, Femi was in his lodge when he received a surprising call from Mr. Bankole. He had been summoned to meet him privately at the office. The next day, Femi arrived Mr. Bankole's office early. It was a massive building. Femi was dressed corporately, his heart racing with nerves. When he stepped inside Mr. Bankole's office, he was sitting behind a large oak desk, a glass of wine in his hand. You've been working hard, Mr. Bankole said, his tone more relaxed than before. I've been watching. Femi straightened up, offering a respectful nod. Thank you, sir. Your business plan, impressive. You've put in the effort, but trust takes time. You're not just building a business. You're building a life for my daughter and grandchild. Femi's eyes widened slightly. I understand. I'm ready for the challenge. I'll make one thing clear, though. You fail once, and you'll lose everything, Irene and your child, the life you're trying to create. Mr. Bankole gave a small smile, handling a check of 10 million naira. Femi's jaw tightened as he collected the check and opened it. Thank you very much, I won't fail, sir. He said, prostrating to greet him. The room grew quiet as Mr. Bankole finished his drink, setting the glass down. Good. We'll see where you are in a year. Keep proving yourself, and perhaps we'll discuss more. Femi left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't an easy road ahead, but every step he took was a step toward redemption. Weeks turned into months, and Femi's logistics business began to take shape. Small deliveries grew into more substantial contracts, and his dedication never wavered. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Bankole saw changes in Irene. Their daughter's smile was genuine again. My water has broken. Irene's frantic cry echoed through the quiet house, jolting her parents awake. Her mother and father rushed to her room, panic etched on their faces as they found her clutching her stomach in pain. Without wasting a moment, they bundled her into the car and sped to the hospital. The drive was tense, with Irene's labored breathing filling the air, but relief washed over them when they arrived at the maternity ward just in time. Hours later, Irene gave birth to a healthy, bouncing baby boy. As the cries of the newborn filled the room, Mr. and Mrs. Bankole stood by, their emotions shifting dramatically. The sight of the tiny baby brought tears to their eyes. All the resentment, anger, and disappointment they had harbored over the past months melted away in an instant. Instead, their hearts were filled with love, joy, and a renewed sense of purpose. This baby wasn't just Irene's responsibility, it was theirs too, a new member of their family to cherish and protect. Meanwhile, Femi was battling Lagos traffic to reach the hospital, his nerves on edge. The long distance and gridlock delayed him, and by the time he arrived, Irene had already delivered. As he stepped into the hospital room and saw his son for the first time, an indescribable wave of emotions washed over him. He walked closer, staring in awe at the tiny bundle of joy. His heart swelled with pride, fulfillment, and an overwhelming sense of joy. In that moment, the reality of fatherhood hit him, and he knew his life had changed forever. Irene, exhausted from the ordeal, had fallen asleep shortly after the delivery. Femi sat quietly beside her, taking in the serenity of the moment. He reached out to gently touch her hand, silently thanking her for their child, before turning his attention back to their son. That evening, Mr. Bankole invited Femi into his study. Unlike their previous conversations, this one began with a warmth Femi had never felt before. Mr. Bankole poured 2 glasses of wine and gestured for Femi to sit. You've done well, Mr. Bankole began, his voice calm and measured. I have to admit, I never thought I'd say this, but you've earned my trust. Femi sat straighter, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and gratitude. Thank you, sir, he said sincerely. I promise to continue proving myself worthy. Mr. Bankole nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That's good. But remember, This is just the beginning. You have responsibilities now. Yes, sir, Femi replied with conviction. I won't let you down. Mrs. Bankole stood quietly at the door, listening to the exchange. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched her husband and Femi bond over their shared love for Irene and the new baby. The family had been through its fair share of struggles, but at that moment, she knew they were on a path to healing. There was hope for a brighter future, one they could all fight for together. A few days later, Irene and Femi officially named their son Jaden, a name that symbolized strength and a new beginning. Little Jaden became the light that united the family, and his arrival marked the start of a journey filled with love, hope, and a commitment to building a better future. Motherhood was no easy feat, and Irene quickly realized that she had underestimated the magnitude of responsibilities it entailed. Despite having her mother's unwavering support and the assistance of househelps, she often felt overwhelmed by the demands of caring for her baby. Her life had changed drastically in just 9 months, shifting from carefree days to a whirlwind of new responsibilities and challenges. Yet, deep down, Irene felt a sense of fulfillment and pride in her decision to keep the baby. Even though her dreams had been put on hold indefinitely, she found solace in the tiny moments of joy motherhood brought her. A year after giving birth to Jaden, Irene made the bold decision to return to school and resume her studies. She re-enrolled in her 200-level courses, having deferred a year to focus on her child. Her return to school wasn't without challenges. Her peers had advanced to 400 level, and Femi, her child's father, had already graduated. Nevertheless, Irene resolved to channel all her energy into her academics. This time, she was more determined and disciplined than ever. Jaden stayed with her parents, which gave her the time and space to concentrate fully on her education. Still, it wasn't easy to navigate life on campus again. Whispers about her situation followed her everywhere, and repeating a class came with its own emotional hurdles. Yet, Irene kept her head high, knowing that her sacrifices were paving the way for a brighter future. Meanwhile, Femi's logistics business began to flourish beyond his wildest dreams. What had started as a modest venture quickly grew into a thriving enterprise. With his newfound financial success, Femi consistently sent money to support Jaden's upkeep, ensuring that Irene and their son lacked nothing. His commitment to his child and frequent visits to the Bankole household strengthened his bond with Irene's family. Over time, he became more than just an outsider, he was treated as a valued member of the family. Femi often found himself contemplating marriage to Irene. He cared deeply for her and wanted to solidify their bond as a family. However, he decided to wait. Irene was still in school, and he felt she needed time to focus on rebuilding her life and completing her education before taking such a significant step. Though he didn't voice his thoughts often, his heart was set on a future where they would raise Jaden together as husband and wife despite the fact that they were very young. For now, he chose patience, believing that the right time would come.